Lepo pozdravljeni. Veselje mi je, da lahko danes tukaj predstavim kolega zgodovinarja, prijatelja, sodelavca Oldricha Tume, ki je hkrati tudi direktor Inštituta za sodobno zgodovino pri Češki akademiji znanosti in umetnosti. Njegova profesionalna pot je zanimiva, kot nekaj drugih čeških kolegov mu pred letom 1991 ni bilo dano, da bi se ukvarjali za zgodovino, s katero se je želel, ampak je svojo kariero začel na področju bizantologije. Po letu 1991 po ustanovitvi Inštituta za sodobno zgodovino pa sem začel ukvarjati tudi za sodobno češko zgodovino. Ta inštitut je njegova temeljna naloga preučevanja zgodovine komunističnega obdobja Češke. Ustanovljen prav za tem namenom, začnejo nekje z letom 1930, potem se detalje se pravi, vključuje že v drugo svetovno vojno. Je zelo ploden avtor, njegova bibliografija je kar obsežna. Eno od takih del, ki je bilo mogoče za nas zanimivo, je zgodovina čeških dežel, ker je sodeloval na novejšem delu ali različna diplomatska zgodovina, moč Češka, Slovaško, Nemčijo, Sovjetska zveza in podobno. Od enega dela, ki se je meni zdelo zelo zanimivo, je delo o hladni vojni na ledu, se pravi v vlogi hokeja v češko-slovaško-ruskih odnosih. In človek je presenečen, kakšne politične konotacije se skrivajo za mehkim črnim pahom. Hvala lepa za prejeko. Seveda po predavanju bo pa profesor odprl za vsakršno vprašanje in razpravo.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak in English, as you could expect. So, before anything else, I thank for invitation to Damian, Pustin, and Zahorazarevic, and I also thank for the nice introduction. At least I hope it was nice. Said about me. So it's my first time in Ljubljana. In fact, I was several times in Slovenia, twice back in Ljubljana. It's a nice experience, and of course I enjoy to be here. So I've been asked to prepare or to present a short and brief survey of Czech historiography of Czechoslovak contemporary history, and this is what I'm going to do now. In fact, those years after 1989 have really brought in Czech context an extraordinary amount of interest in history, especially modern history, so history of the 20th century. I'm not speaking about the interest of the professional community of historians or just educated public, but rather also to the interest of mass media, of politicians, of the general public. And in fact, this is no surprise. History and interpretations of history have played a special role in the Czech public life since at least 19th century. After all, the first great Czech politician of the 1840s to 1870s was a historian, František Palacký, and his interpretation of history gave the Czechs their modern national identity. So those 40 years before 1989, exactly the time between 1948, the communist takeover, and 1989, were in fact without history and produced a hunger for history and literally an eruption of interest in history, as it, after 1989, was suddenly possible to do research, to publish and discuss really any issue. Before 1989, Czech historiography was deformed to a significant degree by the indoctrination and manipulation of the communist regime, and for the field of contemporary history, the degree was almost 100%. The communist regime, especially after the shock it received during the so-called Prague Spring, in the late 60s, came to the conclusion, after analyzing its causes, that historiography in particular, and especially the historiography of modern history, was one of the spheres that had gone beyond the control of the regime in a particularly dangerous manner. it was determined not to let the same mistake happen again. There was no place in the normalized, progress 20 years after 1968, years of normalization, so normalized historical institutes for research on contemporary history or its interpretation. In the 70s and 80s, the regime simply considered it safer to keep silent about its own history. Few works of history are published about the events of 45-48, that is, between liberation until the communist takeover, although they were strictly conformist in respect to the official line, they were history. The era after, they used to be victorious February 1948, was dealt with only in chronological reviews of the history of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia or in propaganda booklets. As for quantity, the volume of domestic independent, samizdat, or exile historiography produced was not much greater, nor could it be. With no opportunity to study in the archives, serious research on recent history was indeed very difficult. This does not mean that the interesting work in the essay, in the genre of essays, did not appear, of course, or that our debates were not conducted on some topics in exile or in independent circles, for example, problems of Czech-German relations or the Prague Spring. Practically the only exceptions, but important ones, were the publications of renowned Czech historian Karel Kaplan. Karel Kaplan was a prominent historian in the 60s, and then he has been expelled from the Inštitut of History after 1969 and so on, and went to West Germany, and he managed to haul with him into exile a significant amount of copied material from the party archives, to which he had access in the 60s as a member of different commissions and so on. In exile, Kaplan published, mainly in German or English, mainly in German, a number of well-documented pieces, especially concentrating on the establishment of the communist regime in Czechoslovakia in the first years of its existence. Thanks to these publications and based on this unprecedented knowledge of the very important source material, Kaplan became one of the internationally acknowledged authorities in the field of research on communist regimes, and especially in the 80s. And until today, he remains one of the most often cited Czech historians abroad. And of course, his books began to be published at home in large volumes immediately since 1990. So therefore, it was quite natural, as I said, that after the Velvet Revolution, the interest of researchers and their audience was focused mainly on the so-called blank spots in Czech or Czechoslovak history. It means the key political events of the last 50 years. This especially meant topics like the expulsion of Germans from Czechoslovakia, the communist takeover 48, the repressive nature of the communist regime, the crisis within the regime, and the intervention of Warsaw Pact armies in 68, the opposition movement during the 70s and 80s, and finally events that were very recent at the time, at the beginning of the 90s, the time of the establishment of contemporary history as an official area of studies, the collapse of communist regime and the non-violent democratic revolution of 1989. But it is perhaps surprising that the issue which resonated most, at least during the first decade after 1989, was not an issue related to the period of communist regime, but the topic of the post-war expulsion of the Germans from Czechoslovakia, the conditions that accompanied it, and they were often very unfortunate, and the broader topic of Czech-German relations in general. The topic was all the more urgent because it was taboo during the previous decades, at least to official historiography. By nature of the matter, including its political topicality, this debate was far from being conducted on academic turf alone, quite the opposite. The spiritus movements of the debates about the transfer or expulsion, different people use different terms, like with the media or with the public discourse in the Czech Republic, but also outside of Germany and Austria. It has been to the credit of the historians. I think that they have mostly succeeded in preventing themselves from being drawn into media arguments directly, and in the majority of cases they have tried to analyze and present this vital topic seriously and in the proper context. While the interest by the media in the problem is inconsistent, rate recurring and fading again at intervals, the attention devoted to the topic and to Czech German relations by historiography in recent years has been much more systematic. The fundamentally important texts were mostly published relatively soon after the fall of communist regime, so in some cases they were in fact written even before it and published only later. Very significant progress has been made during the last 27 years in the actual factography of the eviction of Germans. It began with a work written, as I said, partially before 1989 and published soon afterward, a book founded on independent and detailed knowledge of the broadest range of sources, factually precise, overly presented, and reputably in respect. Book by historian Tomáš Staněk. His groundbreaking work was followed up by a whole series of other works devoted to the explosion in the individual region, specific episode of the so-called wild expulsion of the summer 45, losses suffered during the transfer by ethnic German population in Czechoslovakia, and so on. A number of German works have been issued in Czech translation, especially the memoirs of expelled Sudeten Germans, studies by German historians, especially the important work by Ferdinand Seid, Rudolf Detler, Brandes, and so on. These are also important, the quality of knowledge and are prerequisites for further serious consideration of the history of expulsion of the Czech-German relations. Somewhere on the border between Czech and German historiography is the work of historian Eva Hanová. She's a scholar of Czech origin. She has lived in Germany for decades and shaped by the German academic environment. Her reflections on the collective memory and mythologies of Czechs, but also of Sudeten Germans, as well as her consistent effort to deal with the topic from both sides, made her work a great inspiration, but in fact they are more published in Czech now than in German. Her interpretation of the Sudeten German question as first and foremost a mental problem, and her search for and discovery of new possible perspectives paved the way for the entire discourse, so to perhaps escape from the vicious circle of constantly repeated theses and antitheses. So that was about the Czech-German relations. Then the 45-48 period, the communist takeover, the causes of the communist success, and the character of the short period of regulated democracy, so 45-48, were naturally given significant attention by historiography after 1989. It is perhaps the best mapped and most detailedly described period of Czechoslovakia's history, thanks, as I said, for the most part to the work of Karel Kaplan, not only. The interpretation of the ascension of the Communist Party to power is not a subject of great conflict in Czech historiography. The interest and accent are shifted from the communists to their opponents. Some authors especially emphasize the personal responsibility of President Beneš, but the latest work see the causes of the establishment of communist regime, mainly in the indecisiveness and inactivity of the non-communist political parties. And if we accept Igor Lukeš is again a historian of Czech origin, but he has lived since 40 years ago in Boston, in the United States, and published a rather controversial book on the edge of the Cold War, published first in English and then in Czech. And so if we accept him as a part of Czech historiography, so then the causes of establishment of communist regime are to be seen also in the inactivity and incompetence of policy of United States and not very good performance of American diplomacy in Prague after 1945. So I will still say something about the interpretation of the first years of the regime's history in the end of my talk. So now I would pay attention for a while to the historiography of the Prague Spring. Maybe it's surprising that it really became a subject of really major controversies and re-evaluations. Right away, in 1990, a number of books and journal studies, essays, memoirs, resource bibliographies, academic debates, and so on devoted to the Prague Spring, work of varying professional quality and varying focus started to be published. This was more than natural. The regime that was removed from power at the end of 1989 was, after all, the same regime, ideologically, conceptually, but to a large extent in terms of personnel, that was brought to power 20 years before by Soviet tanks. And research of its history was regarded as an indispensable step into coming to the terms with the past, and to a certain extent as part of the continuing political struggle. It was not insignificant that historical research would have had prosecutable consequences for some of the former communist politicians that took part in preparing and carrying out military invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. The debate of the meaning and value of 1968 soon became a political argument and part of the struggle over the future course of first Czechoslovakia and then Czech society. Many of the protagonists of the Prague Spring reforms, especially Alexander Dubček himself, aspired after 1989 to political careers on the highest level. Attacks from the newly forming liberal and conservative parties of the political spectrum often linked their criticism of attempts at various so-called third ways or socialist orientations to fundamental criticism of Prague Spring, which through their perspective was seen and depicted as a mere factional fight within the Communist Party, the result of which may have been a somewhat more bearable form of communism, but definitely not fundamental reform. The interpretation of the events of 1968 quite logically became part of the dynamic process of shaping the collective memory. Interpretation and conclusion often got ahead of the results of real, genuine historical research. Historical research would, of course, not remain untouched by the societal context, and it partially reacted to the broader social discourse in its questions and answers. The topic itself was highly interesting from a purely professional point of view as well. Of course, suddenly historians were presented with the opportunity to study documents completely unavailable previously, not only from Czechoslovakia, but from the other countries that had intervened in August 1968. It became possible to compare conclusions, for example, without access to the documents. The Soviet decision to intervene militarily had previously been a matter for what we used to call Kremlinology. But now Kremlinology could be compared to the results of research founded upon standard methods of historiography, access to the archive documents, and so on. But I have to say that in many respects the results of the new research confirm the interpretation made before access to archives and so on. Although it is surely a great simplification, it can nonetheless be said that interpretations of the Prague Spring have tended to go into different directions. One interpretation sees the events of 1968 as being an authentic, consistent, and considerate attempt at a fundamental change of system and the implementation of a unique program of democratic socialism. This effort of the reform-oriented wing of the Communist Party had nearly the complete support of Czech and Slovak society, and the attempt was thwarted only by foreign military intervention. The other interpretation regards developments in 1968 having been much more complex. The reformists were willing to make only very limited changes, and their policies were more a series of ad hoc measures in reaction to a changing situation, and the real decisive actor was a reawakened civil society with its own ambitions and programs. If it were not for pressure from abroad and finally military invasion, these two fundamentally, in fact, antagonistic actors, Communist Party and society, would have to have come into conflict. This current of thought is also much more critical toward the clumsy handling of Soviet pressure on the part of Dubček leadership before August and its capitulationist policies after August 1968. So maybe I will leave out the 2 paragraphs about authors and books devoted to different interpretations of 68. I promised not to speak much more than 30 minutes. And I would now turn attention to the works that have dealt with the resistance to the new normalization regime after 68. They constitute a link of sorts of the historiography of the last 20 years of the communist regime's existence. The historiography of that period concentrates especially on thorough analysis of the anti-regime opposition activities. Their protagonists, for instance, there is a series of books, but like serious books and good books on Václav Havel, and naturally on the final collapse of the regime in 1989 and all its consequences. Superficial and sensation-seeking interpretations of the regime's fall, which are based on various conspiracy theories and seem to dominate the public discourse in the first half of the 90s, are really marginal. And now back to the early 50s and so on. During the last decade, the development of the Czech historiography, namely that of communism, seems to have split into 2 lines. On the one hand, there has been a trend toward much more research of social, regional, cultural, and environmental topics, and toward the broader use of special methods and tools, oral history, semantic analysis, etc. On the other hand, political history is being re-accentuated and history is being politicized. This fact reflects the unexpected but rigorous invasion of a new wave of adamant anti-communism into public life of Czech society, sometimes around 2005, but 10 years ago. However, this variety of anti-communism is first and foremost an instrument of actual political fight, and sometimes not against the Communist Party itself, but wielded by the right parties against the Social Democratic Party. The efforts to make use of historical issues in the political discourse resulted, among other things, in the founding in 2008 of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes and in the establishment of a historiography line interpreting the communist regime using a very simplified form of the theory of totalitarianism and concentrating on the research into anti-communist resistance, the so-called third resistance in the 50s. We speak about the third resistance because in Czech historiographic discourse that was the first resistance, means anti-Habsburg resistance in World War I, and anti-German second resistance, anti-German resistance in Second World War, and then the third resistance in early years of the communist regimes. So in the public sphere, the interpretation described above is reflected in the adoption, I think 6 years ago or 5 years ago, of the Act on the Resistance Against the Communist Regime, which grants a resistance member status and some benefits related thereto to individuals able to prove their anti-regime activities and, as the Act's preamble says, particular armed ones. At the time of the 40s and 50s, there was indeed anti-regime resistance in Czechoslovakia, which was tried in terms of its efforts and methods to follow the resistance during Second World War. Tens of thousands were imprisoned, thousands emigrated, hundreds lost their lives. However, many of those who paid with their freedom or inner lives were actually victims of provocations or police and court fabrications and manipulations. The regime was sentencing not only people who were already involved in actions and activities against it, but also those who they might have considered them, and most frequently those who the regime saw as its potential enemies. The manipulated trials were used to eliminate real but much more frequently just potential adversaries. The purpose of the trials, which were invariably given a broad media coverage in the 50s, was to intimidate or mobilize the general public, fund and pinpoint those blamed for economic difficulties, etc. This context also includes cases of armed resistance against the regime. However, these were exceptional. Most of them were local, often very complicated, and not always clearly interpretable motives. Save for a few exceptions, their victims were rank-and-file policemen, lower party officials, border guardsmen, and so on. All who attempted to resist the regime or became its innocent victims deserve our interest and respect. However, their stories do not constitute, in my opinion, the essential part of the regime-society interaction. That was taking place elsewhere and should be examined from different angles. If it were not a history involving human suffering and human tragedies, we could use the term bizarre or even comical in connection with some of the cases. In the early 50s, people were forced to admit their guilt in cases fabricated by the state security, whose members devised extensive underground networks allegedly performing sabotages or preparing assassinations, and whose data. In the 60s, victims of these trials demanded rehabilitation. They were required to prove that they had pledged their guilt of the non-existent crimes under pressure. 40 years later, some of them, or their descendants, asking to be granted the status of a resistance member, must prove, according to provisions of the Anti-Communist Resistance Act, that they had really done what they were sentenced for, or at least they had been making preparations towards that. Such a strange side. So we don't have that picture. That's my picture. So a similar maneuver is being performed by some historians. Works creating a narrative about the existence of very active anti-regime resistance in the early years of the communist rule are based mainly on interrogation protocols and court files, which is in fact very utterly dubious source. So books like that have appeared. I will demonstrate the twist using a very simple example, a photograph used in the jacket of a book on the third resistance. As you can see, it shows a line of armored, determined-looking men. However, those familiar with the realities of Czechoslovakia's history after 1948 smell something fishy. So where and when could the photograph be taken? What action are the men getting ready for? The picture would go well into the context of post-war period in Poland or 56 in Budapest, but Czechoslovakia. But the matter is explained inside the book with very, very small letters. The photograph is identified as a snapshot arranged and made by state security officers in a prison as a piece of evidence for an anti-state activities trial. So the photograph is the same manipulation as forced admissions of guilt and novel sentences. On the jacket of the book, it's a proof of strong anti-communist armed resistance. But as I say, the road toward understanding the past does not mean a mere charge of polarity or a change of a plus sign or a minus sign and vice versa. But of course, in addition to this line of contemporary history, the perspective of which seems to have frozen shortly after November '89, and which continues to perceive itself more or less consciously and intentionally as a part of the fight against communism. Another line has been gradually developing, one that attempts to consider not only the discontinuities caused by the existence of the regime and to go beyond limits of the opposites and contrasts through which we perceive and interpret the historical 48-89 period, the regime and the opposition, the regime and the society, us and them. New topics and new views appear for which the years 48 and 89 are not just divides between two utterly different worlds, so they were, but not only, such as a rule of experts and technocracy, status of minorities, history of urbanism, corporate culture, environmental history, etc. All this is simplification to say that there is division of current Czech historiography in those two lines, but if we accept that simplification, we can say it's like that. However, as a typification of sorts, which might seem the evolution, dynamism, and principle trends, I think it has certain reason to simplify in this way. So, just to finish my maybe too long talk, I believe that looking for transnational perspectives, for instance, and includes cooperation with other partners and context of other histories and other countries, could be one of the essential instruments which could make the contemporary history in the Czech context abandon that frozen state of committed and perpetually fighting historiography and to replace it, but to add also the other kind of historiography and other way how to understand this difficult period of our history. So thank you for your attention, and I'm available for questions for Ljubljana.
Yuri Gašković from the Inštitut of Contemporary History. Thank you very much, Professor Tume. I really enjoyed your lecture. It was, at least for me, very interesting, very informative. I have one such, let's say, general question regarding the last days of socialism in Czechoslovakia, about the collapse of the socialism. Some years ago, when we were together with Jarko in the Prague, I noticed lots of books dealing with this period, but the great majority of them were, let's say, panegyrics to Václav Havel, Občanský forum, to dissidents, etc. I noticed only a few books. One of them was by Michal Pullman, Představa part socialismu v Československu, who were seeing this process, let's say, different. This book was, at least I think, very persuasive. He's claiming, Pullman, that of course dissidents couldn't defeat the socialist regime. They never did, of course. We know this in Yugoslavia, but in Czechoslovakia, I think it was, let's say, the main public view is a little bit different. My question would be, so how is this public view in the main public and in the Czech historiography today? How do you see these events now after 25 years in November 1989? Is still Václav Havel, Občanský forum the key player, or do you see it more like a great collapse of a great regime, and then the dissidents just jumped in?
Okay, so I think you have answered your question already. So in fact, there are both perspectives. That's true that the book by Michal Pullman published 5 years ago, maybe it was really controversial, and there was a lot of reviews and some were very negative and so on. But I think, and on the other hand, but there is something like a current of historiography. Sometimes we call it revisionist historiography. It's not very, it's not very precise term, but revisionist in that it sees the other consequences and other aspects of the development, especially in the 70s and 80s, and this panegyrical historiography, as you mentioned it. But I think this is still there. So, for instance, because last fall there were 2 anniversaries of the birth and of the death of Václav Havel. There was a lot of articles and so on, and movies and documentary movies and so on. So Havel was every day on the pages of the newspapers and so on. And in those days there is a 40th anniversary of Charter 77. So again, there was such a wave of interest in past and mainly the interpretations are that the dissidents were hero when they did it, which is true to a certain extent. I really don't think that it was just a collapse of the regime. So the opposition or the resistance played a certain role, and the fact that especially to Charter 77, there was a permanent V, but permanent opposition. There was something like a horizon, so there was the regime, there was something else and active and so on, played a certain role. So I wouldn't say that the dissidents just jumped into the train in the very last few days and organized it and so on. So the opposition was there, and at least 87, 88, 89. There were repeatedly demonstrations in the streets of Prague almost every month, hundreds of thousands of people there on Manchester Square and so on, and it had changed the public atmosphere. Of course, what happened in Poland and other countries were maybe more important, and people realized that the changes are possible, so especially the elections in Poland and establishment of the Polish non-communist government had a great impact not only on Czechoslovakia but on the other countries, like an example. So it's possible to start the Soviet ends didn't come and didn't start the development. So I would say that if asked personally, Lord Michal Pullman, those panegyric historians, are completely right. So it was something like a mixture.
What about the general public today?
I think it's again. I think it's partly divided, and it's really fascinating how history is being repeated and actualized. We say that. Yeah. So how this struggle is again and again on the pages of newspapers, and you have two camps. So some people, especially those around Václav Havel, those who want to defend and fight for his legacy, so they say that especially Havel and other dissidents did it and so on. So then you have people like former Prime Minister and President Václav Klaus, who always spoke about the implosion of the system. He said, okay, we have to pay attention to what the opposition or the dissidents did, but definitely their actions or their activities were not the main factor, but immediately they attacked him that he's jealous about Havel and he didn't do anything before 1989 and so on. So there are several levels of these discussions. Some, I think, really serious ones between historians, and then something which the mass media and non-public, which is like thesis and anti-thesis, and they don't try to understand each other, but this is just like an instrument for political struggle.
Anders could you say us a little bit about the, let's say, research centers which are dealing with that problems? Because I know that your institute is working on that Ústav pro studio totalitárskych režimů is anti-communist and is focused only on the first few after-war years and those victims. What about not just 45 and 89, about this period between and the so-called intellectual opposition? I know that colleague Jan Mervart from Universita Hradec Králové worked something on 70s, but what about this dissidence and, let's say, the role of some izdat in Czechoslovakia? What's the influence of that on the, let's say, broader public was in Czechoslovakia? Because I don't read Czech, so what I read was only some comparison in English. For example, Barbara Fock, which wrote a monograph about the dissidents in the Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. But is besides your institute, is some in other university centers or some other departments focused on that period, let's say, not just 45 to 48 or not just 89?
Yeah. So there are, so of course, there was kind of development in the last 27 years. So at the beginning, during the 90s, it was especially our institute, but already during the 90s and later, other institutions or centers has been established. So this is this Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, which exists since 10 years ago. Since mid-90s, there was something called the Office for Investigation and Documentation of the Crimes of Communist Regime, a kind of predecessor of that institute. But they did rather interesting work and so on, so it exists still. But what especially happened were new centers and new institutes established at universities, so not only in Prague, but Charles University, so philosophical faculty. There is, for instance, the Institute for, as you know, social and economic history, led now by Michal Pullman. And so, if I should, in a again simplified way, this is the center of the revisionist historiography. So, this center. So, on the other hand, this very strong anti-communist historiography is is the Institute for Studies of Totalitarian Regimes, and we are somewhere between. Sometimes I say, but it's more as a joke, that you can recognize by used terminology who belongs to. So those people in the Institute for Studies of Totalitarian Regimes always speak about totalitarian regimes. So people around Pullman use the term state socialism, it's taken from German historiography. And I think we speak about the communist regime as I would say. Yeah, but there are interesting centers, especially also in provincial universities. Not only in Brno, there is a center for study of democracy and culture, mainly political scientists, but also some historians and so on. So they also used to pay attention to the intellectual history of 70s and 80s, but there are also centers at University of Pardubice and so on, or Ústí-nad-Labem, or in Opava. In fact, the great change in Czech academic world was the establishment of many provincial universities during the last 20 years with faculties of arts and faculties of social science and so on. So this is really much more polycentric. But if asked about this intellectual history, I think that again, this is maybe done in the best way, but in the most respect in our institute, Michal Kopeček and Petro, but especially Michal Kopeček and Matěj Strumý and so on. So there is such a group of relatively young historians, and they are paying attention especially to intellectual history, history of ideas and so on. And they publish in English. So thank you.
Any other question?
Good afternoon. I am interested in the specific period, 45, 48. How it was represented in the school books, textbooks, during, let's say, the communist regime, all the time in the same way, or around 68 it got another stress. So my question would be 45.
So with a short exception, in the late 60s, I think it was used to be explained in the same way as a period of struggle for socialism, so intermediate period. So they used the terms 45 was a national democratic revolution, and then they prepared them and did in a successful way a socialist revolution. So it was, in communist historiography, it was, the focus was on the antagonism between communists and their opponents, between so-called reaction and the progressive forces and so on. So it was only, say, between 65, 66 and 69 to 70 when there were not that many books, but articles and so on, published mainly by communist historians from the Inštitut of History, but with more differentiated focus and so on. So again, Karel Kaplan and Milano Tahal, people around them, they were really very hard discussions within the, so I don't remember as a witness, but I know other people in second half of 60s, really hard discussions within the department of they didn't speak about contemporary history, but the newest history, so within that Institute of History, about the interpretation of what happened in February 48 and about that period of limited democracy, but it didn't. So there were no books published. It was not in those years. Today, if you have a text ready, so you can publish it in 1 month. In those times, it lasted 2 years, and within those 2 years, the political situation changed completely. So. Yeah, but I think they, until the very end, they kept on the same interpretation, struggle between progress and reaction, and even 1989, in February 1989, they organized a great parade of people's militias, so paramilitary force of Communist Party, and they focused on victorious February was something really good to change the history of Czechoslovakia forever.
I would like to ask you to which extent the interest of historiography in Czech Republic is still focused to political history of the the period from 45 to 89. So it means, is there an interest for researching contemporary daily life history, cultural history, sports history, besides your hockey story?
Because in fact it was about ice hockey, but ice hockey is a very important political element. So yeah, it is, I would say, especially saying the development during the last 10 years or something like that, that the attention is paid more and more to those everyday life, culture, the history of urbanism and so on. There is one really very interesting book about the city of Most in northern Bohemia, city which has been completely demolished because of mining coal in 50s to 70s and built a new sites of the communist planning of the cities and so on. Yeah, so clearly and other issues like this technocratic expertise and environmental history we have now developed a small center for environmental history within our institute and so on. So I think it's much wide spectrum of subjects and topics than just political history.
Thus you have studied and published about diplomatic history, and thus I retired researcher at the Institute for Ethnic Studies in Ljubljana, minority studies, dealing also with Slovenian Austrian relations. I have a more precise question. 12 years ago, Czech Republic succeeded the Czechoslovak signature under Austria State Treaty, or to be precise, the State Treaty on re-establishment of independent and democratic Austria. Slovene Republic did until now not so. We have still debate in public among politicians and among international lawyers in Slovenia itself, whether to notify in Russia Slovenia's succession of Yugoslav signature or not. Was or has been that issue of Czech succession under this in this treaty, state treaty, a matter of public debate, a matter of historic researches, of dispute among international lawyers. Are you aware of this fact?
In fact, it wasn't so. So in fact, I'm not aware, which is a proof, more or less, that it really mean subject for discussions or controversies. Which is, if you speak about the relations with Austria, this is interesting because sometimes the relations about that not so easy topic as was the eviction of Germans and treatment of Germans 45 and 46 are on the state level even more complicated issue between Czech Republic and Austria, which is strange because great majority of those Germans were transferred to either Western Germany or Eastern Germany, just tens of thousands to Austria. Even under the communist regime, those who went to Austria were financially recompensated to Satan. The treaty was, I think, 70s. There was a treaty between Czechoslovakia and Austria about the compensations for the property left in Czechoslovakia and so on. So it shouldn't be, or I think it's not a real problem between both countries, but still the positions of Austrian government are in fact much more radical than German government, not some political parties, but the government and so on, but the issue of the state treaty and the very existence of Austria, I think, really never became a never became a subject of any controversies or any public or political discussion. And in case of Czech Republic and Slovakia, I think in most cases simply both states took over the common policy of former Czechoslovakia and wrote it.
The Slovak Republic did not notify its accession in Moscow.
Okay, so I didn't know.
Škešno vprašanje. If not, I'm going to conclude with the last question. I'm interested in the position of the historians after the 1989. We all know that there was some kind of restoration process going on in the Czechoslovakia. How this affects the historian? Does it affect or not?
Again, what was the last sentence?
How the illustration process, which was going on in the Czech society, affected the community of historians?
Well, so the illustration process started in 1991 with an act on illustrations, and it's still valid. Interesting thing is that it was the part of the discussions around it that it's important then and now, and it will be valid just for 5 years or 10 years, but not longer. But repeatedly, it has been prolonged by Parliament, so it's still valid. So there were, I think, different opinions among historians about it, but it didn't happen. So, as for instance, formally, if someone wants to be a director of an institute like ours, you must have a negative lustration. So this is the only formal way in which you can come into relation to that. But I think maybe among historians it was a subject during the 90s and so on, when it was a subject for public discussions. Later it revealed really some discussions when the term expired and then the Parliament decided to prolong the existence of the Illustration Act. I don't think among historians it was really a controversial subject. So, not that much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hvala lepa za udeležbo. Hvala lepa za vaše vprašanje.